All right, welcome everyone. My name is William Dixon, and I am a managing director with a firm called Prescient. Today with me, I have Shay Colson, and Shay is a principal with a firm called Coastal Cyber. Our topic today is to talk about cyber due diligence, and really to talk about cyber due diligence and the aspects of its importance in actually the deal process, understanding maybe the elements that go into it, maybe some of the pitfalls that also come to it. So Shay and I are going to have a pretty lengthy discussion on, what it is that is important for multiple parties to consider in the part of a cyber deal. I'll give a little background on myself, then I'll let Shay introduce himself as well and give a little bit more detail. But like I mentioned, I'm a managing director with a firm called Prescient. We are an intelligence and cyber investigations firm. My background for the past probably 5 or 6 years has been in the incident response space. So I spent some time with some large incident response companies doing more of the, hey, what happens when certain things aren't in place, and responding to the incidents. And a lot of along the lines, we're learning, hey, what are some of the elements that should be in place in a cyber program, not only just from a due diligence perspective, but also just from a general hygiene perspective. I've been in the industry for about 21 years now. And spent time as in the role of a CISO, spent time in big consulting. So this is a topic that over the course of my career has really kind of evolved, but also becoming more prevalent now than ever. Shay, maybe, give everyone a little bit of background of yourself.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Bill. I'm excited to be here today, too. I think this is a really forward-looking and impactful topic, and hopefully we can make it a little more tangible for folks listening. So again, my name is Shay Colson. I lead the cyber diligence practice at Coastal Cyber Risk Advisors. We're a boutique consultancy focused on helping our private equity clients manage cyber risk in not only their new investments, but also in their existing portfolio companies, especially companies who are growing by acquisition. So I hope we get a chance today to talk through a little bit of the nuance around diligence as an investor versus diligence as an operating company. But I think it would be really useful to start maybe, Bill, with a little bit of background on when we say cyber due diligence, what exactly do we mean, and how does that differ from maybe some of the traditional diligence streams in terms of not just legal and tax and financial, but privacy and security and compliance and some of the other things that people maybe are already doing? What's different here, and why is it different? How is it different?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And the concept of due diligence is not new, right? This has been going on for decades, right? Of understanding what you're getting when you make that investment or when you make that purchase or you're even selling, right? And just kind of understanding what's going on there. But the concept of cyber due diligence is probably something that probably over the last 5 to 6 years has really started to pick up steam. And it's a complementary piece to the other pieces of due diligence, whether that be the personnel side, financial, product, whatever it is that particular target organization is you're looking at. But it's really kind of taking a more in-depth look about what is their true risk when it comes to cybersecurity. What is the risk to the data, the intellectual property, really that value of what makes that company valuable, right? And looking at that from a, hey, what's that exposure? Has there been exposure of that information? What's the likelihood of that happening? And then baking that into, the overall process of a deal making. And, Shay, when I look at a lot of this, it's interesting because I get asked a lot of questions like, well, when is the appropriate time to do this type of check, right? When does it make sense to do a due diligence in cyber? And I know you've got, quite a bit of, information and experience in looking at that. And I guess, what do you see? We described a little bit of just the general process, and we could definitely go into detail on that. We could probably talk all day about that as well. But I mean, just like, what is that inflection point? What is the point where this starts to matter?
Yeah. No, I really like how you framed it as a risk quantification exercise. And I think that's something that makes it a little bit different from a traditional diligence work stream. And what we mean by that is, instead of just saying, hey, they've represented the revenue this way, do the books bear that out? They've told us they do these things from a compliance perspective. Are the lawyers telling us that they do those things? This is much more around, to your point, the likelihood and the impact of a cyber incident occurring after the transaction, right? So we're looking at making an investment, making an acquisition, and what we're trying to understand is, have the targets already done reasonable amount of work to manage down those risks? And if they haven't, or if they haven't managed it down to a point that we're comfortable with, what's it going to take to do that? And so I think the other piece that we really need to bring into the fold here is the investment thesis, right? So if you're looking at either a tech transformation, maybe from an on-prem enterprise play to the cloud, or you're modernizing the tech stack, or you're looking to take the piece of technology that this target company has built and grow it and leverage it, all of those things have potential for kind of outsized cyber risk. And I think that's the other piece around the motivation here is that as investors, we're looking for growth in our investments. And that's the big reason why we should be focusing on cyber diligence now is, yes, there's going to be costs for response. Yes, there's potential for litigation, reputational impact. All of those things are true. But the real cost as investors is a cyber incident is going to flatten our growth curve, and it's going to distract our senior leaders and our technical talent from building the business, which is what we're all here to do. So I think that's the big difference here for cyber due diligence. And it's probably also why it's relatively limited. It's still, the forward-looking kind of tech-heavy investors who are doing this on a regular basis. It's not a full-fledged part of each work stream. But I do think it will be, and I think it's kind of like this compounding interest effect. The sooner you start doing this, the more benefits you're going to reap. So, would you agree with that?
Yeah. No, I 100% agree with that. And I think one of the things you highlighted, right, is, why this is becoming important. It's just not like someone had a light go on in their head, like saying, hey, we need to do cyber due diligence, right? There may be some person out there that did that, but really this is the effect of, of pain, right? Of something happened.
Yeah.
We should have handled this before. I mean, this was in the last 6 years. I was on a engagement where, yes, they did post-deal due diligence, right? After the fact, and they uncovered so many different things that would have made life so much easier from a transition of the acquisition into the company, making maybe some potential more concessions during the deal-making process as well that would come up. And what we ended up doing is having to kind of pick up some of the pieces that were there, part of the deal was, hey, let's retain maybe some certain talent. Well, that talent left. Along with that talent left the knowledge, for example, just in the security team. So these are, some of that pain that, and this is just one example, right? There's plenty of them out there where that pain is felt. And I think, that's one of the things that I see as an advantage of doing this up front is, to be able to avoid that, as part of the process. And especially if this is a high profile acquisition as well, depending on what that is, it only helps the process. And, Shay, when I'm talking to you a lot about this topic, one of the things that often comes up is what is the actual mechanics of these, right? Say we're sitting here talking about, okay, what is this due diligence? And we kind of maybe hit on that a little bit, but like, what is the things that we're doing to avoid the pain?
Yeah, this is a great question because I think it helps to make it really clear and tangible. And so when we run diligence engagements for clients, there's 3 pillars to the exercise. There is one that is an external look at kind of the threat intelligence that's available and the attack surface of the target. So that kind of outside in look. The second is the internal mechanics of how the target is managing their cyber risk, and that's policies and penetration tests and risk assessments and control maturity. And then the third is to bring those 2 things together to actually talk to the security leadership of the target and either reconcile any inconsistencies, figure out where and how deeply these controls are deployed, and then distill all of that down into a report that goes to the investment committee that really focuses on the so what question. Okay, there are risks or there are findings. So what, right? How bad is it? What's it going to take to fix? How much of it should we fix? In what order? Those sorts of things. And so I think that is really the 3-step process. But there are things that we don't do during a diligence exercise that are equally important, right? We don't have the time or the level of access or the level of participation to do a penetration test, right? So if there's no penetration test that's been done that the target can provide, we're going to put it on the list to get done post-transaction, but we're not going to hold up the deal for 6 weeks to run this test, right? Similarly for risk assessment and other things. And so what we're trying to do is recognize that the deal landscape is still very competitive, timelines are compressed, access is limited, and we're trying to give the best view that we can with the data and access that we have, with the notion that, great, we're going to manage this post-transaction. And I really like your story about thinking through those things that would have been nice to have in place once the deal closes, because that's really the goal, right? By the time cyber due diligence starts, the deal team has already made the pitch, the kind of proposal's been accepted, advisors have been engaged. Cyber due diligence rarely kills a deal. Maybe if it was already kind of on its deathbed, it might be the nail in the coffin. But the real goal here is that the business fundamentals are solid. We've done the homework there. How do we shore that up so that we can make it grow the way we want to with the rest of our investment? And that's what the diligence should focus on. And I think that's why it's hard to do and hard to do well, is because it's deeply technical, but framed in the commercial.
Yeah, I really liked how you also mentioned the so what aspect of it, right? Because really the consumers of a cyber due diligence report and outcome are not going to be more than likely not going to be a technical team, right?
Right.
So translating that into business speak, right? And we hear that a lot. What does it actually mean? Well, in this context, it's like, well, what is the risk, right? If you're looking at it from a pure risk model, okay, what is the likelihood of this event coming true? They can then look at it and say, okay, I'm going to analyze this. Can I accept that or not? Do I need to go in and mitigate it? Or I need, like you mentioned, have it as a post-transaction requirement, right? And
Yep.
I think those are framing it that way. And a lot of the work, when I'm seeing in doing these, it's like when you do it that way, it makes it much more interesting because it's really it's the same language that they're doing in all the other business due diligence activities, right? Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
Oftentimes I've seen, you've got quality due diligence on the business side of things, but then the technical side or cyber comes in and it's just like, great, we did it, but what do we
Yeah,
do, right?
there's a slide in the deck. We've checked that box, right? And honestly, that's been kind of status quo up until this point. But now, cyber incidents have this really outsized nonlinear impact, and it always happens at the worst time, right? I was on an engagement within the last couple of years where a company that was being diligenced was actually hit with a ransomware attack during the diligence period. And so, of course, there's lots of ramifications for that, not the least of which are adjustments down in the acquisition price and extension of the runway post-transaction to get back only to where they were, not even to get ahead and grow. And I think this is really the thing that I keep coming back to. But when we come back to the, like, why do we do this, right? Why would we spend money and hire advisors to look at these things? It's because these little incidents that are a click on a link in an email could lose 2 quarters of growth. And if you're only holding this company for 3 years, you're taking a significant percentage of that growth away. And then you have to explain it at the next transaction, right? Because it's really hard to hide the fact that you've had an incident. The threat actors want people to know that you got ransomed, that you didn't pay, that they leaked your files. And so, of course, when the next diligence team comes along that's not you and I, they're going to go find that and they're going to have questions. And we want to avoid all of that.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point there. It's because you mentioned, how long you're going to hold this investment, and there are different types, right?
Sure.
You're either the investor, you're giving funding or whatever to the organization, or you may be the company that's acquiring someone in. And
Yep.
your view of that is going to be different based off of that. Maybe if you're in one of those boats, you're more than willing to accept some sort of risk, in those types
Yeah.
of scenarios. But I mean, from your experience, I mean, what is it that you're seeing, like a lot of the, I guess, maybe in those different categories, we call those, okay, you've got an investor, you've got an
Yep.
acquirer, right? And those are two
Yep.
different types, maybe, and they all have different interests. Obviously, there's common ones too, but I mean, what are some of the, things that, okay, maybe this is weighted more versus the other?
Yeah, I think from an investor perspective, it's fairly straightforward in terms of once you identify the risks, you're going to need to mitigate those. Do they have the talent and the tools to do that? If not, then and the time. If not, then what's it going to take in dollars to get that talent, tool set, and time? I think it's much more interesting when you're an acquirer for a couple of reasons. One is that if you're big enough to be making acquisitions of other companies, you've likely got a security team or some sort of security governance in-house already. And so the goal now becomes aligning the target's state versus what your enterprise's state is, and figuring out what the gap is, figuring out that delta, and then what it's going to take to close the gap. And sometimes it's really straightforward and you can bring them up to speed in a quarter or two and you're on your way and you get the benefits of synergy and the investment flourishes. Other times it's not nearly as straightforward, and for reasons you might not expect. right? So maybe they have all of these security controls in place, but their tool set, their stack is the exact opposite of yours, right? You're in cloud A, they're in cloud B. You use email provider A, they use email provider B. And so you've got to understand how to reconcile those things. And now, you've kind of spilled into this world of, are we going to become multi-cloud just because we bought this other company and it's too expensive to move them? I think there's all these unintended consequences that can come into play when you're an acquirer, and that's where having somebody who is commercially oriented but technically conversant and maybe a little more strategic is exciting. I think you've probably bumped into a few of these stories along the way where more than meets the eye once you peel back the covers, right?
Oh, well, absolutely. And I think you bring up a good point, especially on the acquirer side, is, oftentimes they're concerned about, okay, we're going to keep this technology, we're going to get rid of this. And, you're kind of playing the which one, there's factors that go into it, right? Usually a lot of it's money, the other part is just expertise that exists. But a lot of times too, what gets thrown out the window is the security stack on top of that, right?
Yep.
And, let's say you have system A and you've established, these top tier security controls, but you're going to go with system B, who, needs a 6-month ramp up to even get where system A is at.
Right.
Those are some things to consider. And those are, that's maybe not going to be in every single depth of due diligence, but those are the types of things too, that as part of this process, we start to plant those questions, right? So you
Yes.
can at least make those decisions. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like the way you frame that, because the other thing that we see, and I think we're going to see more of it with these market conditions, is carve outs and spin outs. And the thing to be wary of, or at least to be looking at from a cybersecurity perspective, is, those enterprise carve outs were likely inheriting a lot of their security controls and good security posture from the parent company, probably identity and endpoint management and the edge controls and backup, all those kind of core blocking and tackling things. It's highly unlikely that they're going to be able to take all that capability with them. So whether you're an acquiring company or an investor, thinking about how they're going to meet those controls once they aren't inheriting them from the parent is going to be really critical. And if you don't have a plan for that, if that's not actually documented, it's definitely not going to happen as smoothly or as quickly as you'd like it to, right?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And that's one of the things I'm starting to see, and maybe you've come across this too, is, acquisition strategies are starting to include security, right? Whether that's from the investor side, especially on the investor side. Obviously, I think a lot of that is on the acquire side, but the investor side is looking at, it's okay, if we're going to make this type of investment and we want to see the return that we expect from this investment,
Yep.
they're starting to realize security is a important component to not necessarily assure that return, but to make sure it doesn't, hit a roadblock along the way.
Yeah. No, and actually I've seen clients really look for ways to use security as a value creator, particularly acquirers. So one of the ways that might come about is a larger company acquiring a smaller one where they're just less mature, right? The target is just a less mature organization. They're in the growth phase, they've invested in growth and maybe not in their governance and maturity. And so maybe they're lacking a good bit of these controls. Well, if the acquirer has them in place and has a team and has a program and can immediately, or at least very rapidly, roll those down to the target, that's a great way to kind of negotiate thoughtfully when you're making the acquisition about what you're going to need to do to get them up to speed, but then have your team ready to go, roll them down, boost that maturity, and almost immediately create value that then continues to protect the enterprise as it grows. It's a really nice way to approach it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think part of that is giving them the right information and tools to do that, right? I mean, it comes
Yep.
down to the information and how it's presented, right? The first step is even doing it in the first place.
Yes.
Let's maybe take a step back from what it is you're actually providing, but actually taking the step to do it. And then there's various tiers of that. But being able to actually go in and say, okay, we know we want to look at this particular function and incorporate this not only into the deal, but then into the culture of whichever that we're trying to project going forward. And that kind of leads me into, to get to that point though, there has to be that information, right? And
Yep.
I think, I think it's safe to say the cyber due diligence, let's just call it, maybe we call it industry. I think
Sure.
you
The
probably could call
landscape.
it industry, right? Has kind of, it's evolving, right? And there's multiple ways to conduct this, some more effective than others. But, maybe some of the things that you've seen about, okay, and you mentioned this earlier, some limitations, right? You're not going in and doing the in-depth risk assessment, right? But, what are some of those, I wouldn't call them limitations, but I guess technically they are, but limitations of what is being done versus what should be done, and then kind of
Yeah.
aligning those to, where they should be.
Yeah. So I think there's a few things you can do to get the most out of your cyber due diligence. One of the things that I see regularly that is unfortunate is the investors will say they're doing cyber due diligence, but really it's just the lawyers with 3 or 4 kind of questions about, do you do this? Do you do that? Check, check, check. And that is fine. It's not very helpful, right? It's not very strategic. It doesn't really kind of identify those risks and help plan them forward. So I think moving beyond this kind of notion of the checkbox and really allowing some engagement where there's some, reconnaissance or intelligence gathering, there's some conversation, and then there's some synthesis between those two things. We also see a lot kind of just the outside in. So I'm just using BitSight or Security Scorecard or something else to kind of give me a quick flyby, and then I'm putting that in as good enough. It's a good starting point, but certainly it's not enough. And I think the third thing that both investors and acquiring companies can really do to help themselves here is read the cyber due diligence folks in on the deal thesis, right? What's the play here? What are we going to do? Why are we making this investment? Because if we on the practitioner side can understand that, that really helps us kind of cue in on the things that might impact you executing on that thesis. If we're just flying blind or we're evaluating it in the abstract, that's better than nothing, but we can really supercharge the output and tailor it to, your value proposition here if you just let us join the party.
Yeah, exactly. It's always, that's the always question. Just give us a seat at the table,
That's
And I
right.
think that's on us too, though, right? It's to and that's where it
Absolutely.
comes out to presenting things in the business value. And I think, just the security industry in general is evolved to having that discussion. But we're still. So I think that's the reality. I'm gonna ask a question, maybe switch a little gears here, and I'm gonna put on my like into the future hat, right?
Okay.
So in the future, I guess if we're having this discussion, let's say, 2 years from now, right? And there's a lot of conditions that can happen. One is the market, as we maybe see
Yeah.
now, and some, just other things that we don't know what's going to happen. But if you're looking at, the role of cyber due diligence, not only today, but let's say 5 years from now, how do you see that starting to pick up
Yep.
and getting more uptake?
Yeah, I think one of the things you're going to see is it will be more consistently applied across the deal landscape and with more depth and rigor than it is today. I think you're seeing this already being driven by the SEC's proposed cyber regulations, where those might get watered down a little bit when they're finally implemented. But any company who dreams of going public should be able to meet those goals. And I think the other thing is they're pretty stringent guidelines. You're not going to be able to bolt that on in the 11th hour and say, yep, I'm compliant with that as well. You're going to need to kind of get the real work done, and that takes time. At the same time, I think you're going to see both LPs and investors look to cyber as another differentiator. We've seen it happen with kind of ESG and environmental impact and social good. We're going to see the G get its time in the sun, and cyber governance is a big part of that. And so I think we're going to see some increased emphasis all around. And then finally, I think we're going to see it move down market. I think we're going to see, investments that were typically smaller or companies that were typically less technical still get this type of cyber analysis because of that impact, right? It really does come down to dollars and cents. And if we're putting money in and cyber could put that money at risk, we should at least understand that element. So what do
Yeah.
you see in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of you said. One thing I do think that will start to come up, and it's always varying degrees of how this will be applied. You mentioned the SEC rules and guidelines, right? I think we're going to see more an expansion of those type of guidelines, and depending on where they come in, and maybe that's just in some sort of a regulatory process. I do think that is going to be more ingrained into the regulatory process for this type of activity. I think there's obviously other disclosures that have to happen as part of that anyways. I think depending on the deal, first of all, it's just going to be something that is just going to be part of the landscape. Now, the trick is it's making that actually substantial and just not getting by with the regulation, right? And I think
Right.
we're kind of at a spot right now where we can actually show how substantial it can be. And then we're addressing security, and the compliance and regulatory stuff is then the byproduct of that, right? As we're
Yep.
doing this. So that's kind
And
of what I see going.
I think that's the real point, is that instead of trying to aim to do all this just to be compliant, if you aim to do this and be secure, you'll be compliant as well, right? It's often said that compliance is not security, and I think that's generally true. It's largely also true that security is not compliance, but it's much easier to be secure and then show compliance than to be compliant and try and show security.
Yeah, no, and I agree. So I mean, in this particular, this landscape, it's just going to come down to the extension of what security already is, right? I think you
Yep.
started to see that. It started with, hey, let's bring security out of IT. Let's bring it
Right.
into these other factors. And I just see this more becoming just part of business, right? And I think taking away the technical aspect of everything, because every practice has its own technicality to it, right?
Of course.
Within, not just, it has to be like something in IT, but taking that technicality out and say, hey, let's bring it into the picture now. If we can present our findings, or however we want to show this, in that risk picture, and I keep going back to that, I think this will just make this much more easier to do, and kind of take away maybe some of that unknowns that are going out there as well about what
Yep.
this actually is trying to accomplish.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think we're also going to see more engagement from the leadership, whether it's the investment committee, the boards of these companies, the LPs, all of which are going to be not only more keen on cyber, but we're going to see more and more cyber expertise from the folks in those roles, and they're going to be asking better questions. And it's going to be harder to bluff your way through some of the answers, and that's a good thing, right? And that's what
Yes.
you and I both want to help clients be able to do, is be honest and forthright about that, and then also use it to improve the business. And that's the goal at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, absolutely. A mentor of mine once said, is like, if you're going to present any numbers, you better be ready to answer every single question about what those numbers are going to bring, right?
Yep.
Because that will come up in there. And that's what I think, the one things we're talking about is, okay, let's present this in a way that we can back this up with factual information, at least to make a decision.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think that's the goal, right, of cyber due diligence, is to show an ROI on the spend. If you can understand the risk that you're undertaking in a better lens and have some mitigation strategies, even if you decide not to implement them, you've at least made an informed decision, and that's a much better position to be working from. And really, that's the goal for all of our clients, is to give them the information to make a better business decision.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good.
100% agree with that.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it up, and I really appreciate the time today and the discussion. And if there's any questions, certainly please reach out and let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. And Shay, remind everyone where they can find you and Coastal Cyber.
Yep, we're online at coastalcyber.io, but LinkedIn is probably the best place to get me. It's somewhere that I am very regularly, if not every day, if not more than I should be, but it's a good spot.
Yeah, if you get, I recommend checking out Shay's LinkedIn feed. Very informative and some quality content there.
I do what I can. And then how about you, Bill? Where can we find you?
Well, yeah, we're available at prescient.com. That's prescient.com. We've got a presence on social media, LinkedIn. So yeah, we're out there, and the part of what we're trying to accomplish too is just to make this more useful to our audience, right? And use this as a tool to really get out there and spread the importance of the topic that Shay and I are talking about, because we live it every day and it's out there.
Yep, very good. So, all right,
Okay.
until the next one, take care.
All right, take care.